Today's topic deals with something. It involves a former United Methodist pastor. This is not anti-UMC. This is something that all local churches can be affected by. I'm hoping that the Global Methodist Church keeps itself safe from this, but this is just kind of a representative story of things that happen all the time. So, this is an article by the Times Union, written by Brendan Lyons, published yesterday. Former pastor accused of sex abuse later ran kids' clown shows. So, big nightmare here. Warren County and the UMC have agreed to pay $875,000 to settle a lawsuit filed on behalf of a man who was sexually abused as a child. So this was a big crew at their state capitol that passed a bill a while back, passage of the Child Victims Sex Act in the Capitol in 2019. So this is in Albany. Warren County and the UMC have agreed to pay $875,000 to settle a sexual abuse lawsuit filed on behalf of a man who was sexually abused as a child nearly 50 years ago by a former minister who had also been the boy's foster parent. Ugh. The former pastor, now 82-year-old Richard A. Reynolds, is a Guilderland resident who previously operated a professional clown business for more than 2 decades, including at area children's events. After his retirement from the UMC 25 years ago, according to his online profile and attorneys in the case. So it says he retired from the UMC, which indicates he was not removed. In at least 2 lawsuits filed under New York's Child Victims Act, Reynolds has been accused of molesting numerous boys in the 1970s and 1980s when he was assigned to the North Creek Methodist Church in Warren County and also the FUMC in Gloversville. New York's Child Victims Act temporarily lifted the statute of limitations to allow alleged victims of sexual abuse to file once time-barred claims against their abusers of the institutions that harbored them. So what it's saying here is usually in a court of law, there's a statute of limitations. You can only go back so many years in order to file suit against someone for a sexual violation. In New York, they removed the statute of limitations so that all abusers of all times that are still living can be prosecuted. In one of these cases that recently settled, Reynolds had allegedly sexually abused the victim, who was 11 when it began, while working as a foster parent for the Warren County Department of Social Services. Under the settlement, Warren County paid $750K and the church paid $125K. Officials within Warren County declined to comment. The UMC did not immediately respond to a request for comment. So Vincent T. Napo, an attorney for the plaintiff in the case, said the county had failed, quote, failed to supervise and protect our client for years on end, leaving our client vulnerable to unthinkable acts of sexual abuse by the very adult charged with his protection. No child should ever have to endure such trauma and abuse. So it's worth remembering, whenever this money is awarded the victim, that money doesn't come out of nowhere. That money actually, in this case, coming from the county, came from taxpayers. And so this is why taxes get higher. This is why money continues to get devalued and a dollar gets stretched. It's because we're continually funding things that feel free, they're not free. But secondly, whenever you have someone operate as an extension of the church or as the state, they make those bodies liable. So that's exactly what happened here. Because this man was operating as a foster parent, an agent of the state, and as a pastor, an agent of the church, both of those entities can now be sued, and both lost a significant amount of money rightly because they are responsible for the misconduct of this person in authority. Napo added that, quote, it is unclear when the church first received reports of Reynolds' sexual abuse of children, but it appears the first victim came forward after the abuse ended. The church sent Reynolds for sexual deviancy treatment and then allowed Reynolds back into its congregation to continue serving its leadership positions where he would have access to the children, Napo continued. The church never reported Reynolds to law enforcement and, in fact, pleaded with the victim's family to keep the abuse silent out of fear of bad publicity. This is so damning. And the reason it is because, well, not the reason, an area of overlap here. This is what's making the rounds in a lot of national media right now. Texas megachurch pastor Robert Morris resigns 3 days after confessing to engaging in sexual behavior with a child, as his church issues a blistering statement. So he is the founder and senior pastor of Gateway Church in South Lake, which is a huge church, mega church. He was an ex-Trump advisor, and I read the story. He molested, it was decades ago, but he was a young traveling pastor. He would stay in the homes of people who trusted him, and in one of these homes, there was a 12-year-old girl that he, according to him, according to her even, did not have sexual intercourse with, but molested very invasively and over a period of years, many times. Uh, uh, it's just horrible. It's just it's horrible. So, Allie Beth Stuckey had a good take on all this stuff. She said, Pastor Robert Morris is one of the most influential pastors in the world, leading a church that gathers about 100,000 congregants each week. Today, he resigned after an alleged victim accused him of molesting her when she was between the ages of 12 and 16. And he was a married father and pastor. In response to her recently published story, he didn't deny the accusations, but rather described his behavior as inappropriate sexual behavior with a young lady, which implies a consensual interaction with an adult. But in reality, if her testimony is true, he sexually assaulted a preteen and was never held accountable, properly held accountable for it. So, yeah, the article we just read said that he had to go through sexual deviancy training, whatever that is, and then he was allowed to enter back into the pulpit. And the church interceded with the family, begging them not to file charges, not to have this actually taken care of, which is scandalous. The accuser, according to Stuckey, told her parents in 1987, and her father went to Morris's church leadership and urged them to remove Morris from his position. Morris stepped away from ministry for 2 years, then was restored as a pastor. But if her accusations are real, he never should have been restored. Child molestation isn't just a sin, it's a crime. This should have been handled by civil authorities, which God gave us to keep evil in check. Instead, it was brushed under the rug after he was restored. Let's get something straight. Repentance and restoration does not include restoring an accused abuser to a leadership position. If, in fact, the claims against him prove true, he can be forgiven, he can be restored to the body of Christ, but he failed to fulfill the requirements for overseer God gives us in his word, and his sin may have posed a real threat to vulnerable members of the flock. A person like this should not be a pastor again. And that is where my concern is we, I love that we have a faith of reconciliation, restoration, grace, forgiveness, but I don't like our understanding of these things, that it's as though these things never happened before. You know, it's I can forgive someone who does my kids wrong. You know, it'd be very hard, but that's the expectation. But they're not going to get access to my kids again. Period. They obviously can't control themselves. Uh, I pray to God I'm never in this situation. But you cannot just say, okay, they went through a time of training and trial. It's all erased now. That's not how things work. There is damage done that is not going to disappear from the historical record, is not going to no is going to be erased from the children's lives who experience this. It's an abuse of power. So I feel for it does happen sometimes that false accusations are made against pastors that create a stink, and then the pastor can't do ministry anymore. That really stinks. I wish there were never false accusations made. I hope that all false accusations are exposed for what they are, but even if they're not, you cannot have someone in leadership. You cannot have someone in leadership, even if they've gone through a time of restoration, and even if they're forgiven by the victim. If they have abused, uh, it's my mind that if they've abused someone sexually, even if they haven't abused somebody, if they've stepped out on their wife, if they, in their capacity of pastor, have committed adultery, then I think that they're no longer eligible for ministry ever. And similarly with money, if they've betrayed the trust of the congregation and stolen from the congregation, I just think it's fine to have them restored to the community. Maybe, if they've abused a child, they should never be with children. Period. But if there was sexual misconduct, but they can be restored, not in a ministry capacity, not in a leadership capacity. I'm open to that. But to put him back in the pulpit is just a terrible decision. It's terrible discernment. I think everybody wants some kind of happy ending and to sweep things under the rug. We don't want to acknowledge that some things are just going to be broken until Christ comes again in victory. But I think this is one of those things. You cannot have leaders of the flock who have preyed upon the flock in the past. You just can't. The other thing I wanted to make sure I knew to say was every single local church, doesn't matter how big you are, there should be a policy in place where children are never alone with an adult, with just one adult. There always needs to be two adults present. There should never be any kind of prolonged scenario where an adult is alone with one child or multiple children. And I get that. I mean, I lead two very small churches, and that just means some things are not going to get done where I'm going to do my best to minister to the children as I'm able. But if another adult is not there, I am not there. Accusations cannot be made against me. It just cannot happen. It would do so much harm to these churches. It would do harm to me and my family. It's just irresponsible. I remember several years ago during the Me Too stuff, there was also an awareness that sometimes women make accusations. And so I'm one of these pastors that has a policy. I'm never alone with women. And I know that a lot of people took great offense to this because it limits the mobility of women. And it is what it is. Whenever accusations can be made, you have to behave responsibly. Now, granted, when we're talking about Reverend Morris or this clown pastor, this was decades ago. But to imagine that this kind of behavior doesn't happen anymore is stupid. There is still sexual abuse in the church. Now, I should be clear, it's not nearly as bad in the church as it is in public education, as it is in other institutions, but it still exists, and the church should never um, be lax in protecting vulnerable people in our midst. There needs to be a culture of multiple adults being present anytime there's ministry with children, period. I'll read a little bit more and then we'll conclude this. The church sent, oh, wait, we already did that. In an interview Monday, Reynolds was asked several times by a reporter if he denies the sexual abuse allegations or wanted to commented on them. And he said, no, that was a long, long, long time ago. He said, adding that he closed down his clown business when the COVID pandemic struck. So it's just, we want to imagine there aren't people like this, but there are tons of creeps in the world. Can you imagine he got exposed for molesting kids and then opened a clown business and was allowed? I mean, what do clowns do? They hang out with kids all the time. What is it? John Wayne Gracie was a serial killer, was a clown. They use this to get close to kids. And I mean, it's wonder. I have kids. I get why people love kids. Some people cannot be responsible around kids. Should never be around kids. It's appalling to me that this guy was allowed to do what he did and that nobody came after him. This is why you can't trust the state. You have to have vigilant people guarding our children in our societies. You're going to write an article, which is not going to look good for me, said this guy. Is that right? Well, that was a long time ago, and I'm 82, and I'm getting a tinge of Parkinson's disease, I think. Um, there's more to it, and I put the link in the show notes so you can read more of that on your own. But I needed to do my part. I want to do my part. I don't know how many people are going to watch this. I want to do my part to urge any pastors and laity who watch this in the local church, make sure that everybody knows. Don't just have a policy on paper that your board knows. Make sure everybody knows the culture of the local church protects children. You are not going to have any scenarios where children are alone with an adult. Doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, if they're old or young. No clowns ever. This is a hobby horse of mine. I think clowns are icky. And I'm sorry if you know and love a clown, but I think they're an interesting thing from the past. But to have them around kids, it's just icky. And magicians, seriously, magicians operate in deception. I get that they're funny and it's fun and you love the wonder on the kid's face. But look, the church is not here to entertain kids or to manipulate or mislead kids. The church is here to lead kids to Christ. And clowns and magicians don't do that. Who does that is humble servants of Christ that work in concert to properly catechize and indoctrinate children. Let other institutions mess with them in other ways, but the church needs to show them Jesus. And so I hope that I help. If I just help one person get clear, okay, the church is not going to be working with these wonky people that want to mess with our kids. We're just going to have normal people working crews of at least two with our children. Now I understand that means some churches can't have like one person sitting in the nursery with kids during worship, so that's okay. You should have children in worship. Children should know how to worship. And if your old folks can't tolerate kids in worship, they need more Jesus in their heart. Okay. So this is one of those things where if you get this policy right, you get a right relationship with kids, it can actually minister to your church and help them get over themselves and not be such consumers. So I've got probably 100 more things to say on this topic, but I'm going to end on the note: make sure your local church is protecting children. Do not become a body that makes room for evil. Do not allow for people in authority to interact with vulnerable people one on one. And that also means having laity in your church that come to the pastor and say, look, anytime you want to go visit an elderly person, anytime you want to minister to the kids, anytime you want to meet privately with a woman, if you're a man, then listen, call on me. I'm happy to be there. I'll just be quiet, but if you're laity, consider the ways in which you can help your pastor be present and not put others at risk and not put himself or herself at risk. So pray about these things, think about these things. That'll be the end of me talking about it today.